In the spring of 1944, the coast of England had become the most crowded place on Earth. Millions of Allied soldiers were crammed into every forest, village, and port, waiting for the signal to cross the English Channel. But across that narrow strip of water, Adolf Hitler and the German High Command were waiting too. They knew a storm was coming, they just didn't know where it would land. To ensure the success of the Normandy landings, the Allies launched Operation Fortitude, the greatest lie ever told in the history of warfare. The centerpiece of this deception was the creation of a ghost army. If you were a German spy looking across the water at Dover, you would have seen a terrifying sight. Thousands of tanks, trucks, and landing craft belonging to the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG. You would have seen massive oil storage tanks and barracks being built at lightning speed. But if you had walked up and touched one of those tanks, your hand would have bounced back. They were made of rubber. These were inflatable decoys designed by set designers from the film industry and artists from London. From the air, a German reconnaissance pilot would see a massive armored division ready to strike the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing point to France. But on the ground, a single American soldier could lift a Sherman tank with one hand. To make the illusion perfect, the Allies didn't just build rubber tanks, they created a phantom atmosphere. They used giant speakers to play the recorded sounds of tank engines and construction work that could be heard miles away. They drove real trucks in circles to create heavy tire tracks in the mud, leading to nowhere. The commander of this fake army was none other than General George S. Patton. The Germans respected and feared Patton more than any other Allied general. By placing him in charge of this ghost force, the Allies convinced Hitler that the real invasion would surely happen at Pas-de-Calais, led by their best commander. Patton was seen at dinners and public events in the Dover area, all part of a carefully choreographed performance to keep German eyes fixed on the wrong place. But the deception went even deeper into the world of shadows. The Allies used the double-cross system, turning every single German spy in Britain into a double agent. These spies fed Berlin a constant stream of top-secret information about the fake buildup at Dover. Meanwhile, in the basement of Bletchley Park, the ultra-code breakers were listening to the German response. They felt a surge of triumph every time they intercepted a German message stating that the real threat was still at Pas-de-Calais. Even as the real fleet began to move toward Normandy on the night of June 5th, the Ghost Army was still hard at work. Small boats equipped with reflector balloons sailed toward Calais, creating a massive electronic signature on German radar screens that looked like a giant invasion fleet. For hours, German commanders sat in their bunkers, convinced that the Normandy landings were just a diversion and that the real attack was still coming to Calais. The Ghost Army had won. Hitler was so convinced by the deception that he held back his elite panzer divisions for weeks after D-Day, waiting for an invasion at Calais that would never come. Operation Fortitude didn't just save thousands of lives on the beaches of Normandy. It proved that in war, a rubber tank can sometimes be more powerful than a real one. The Ghost Army had performed the ultimate magic trick. They made the most powerful army in history look in the wrong direction at the most critical moment in human history.
In the final hours of June 5, 1944, the sky over southern England hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration that shook the very ground. Over 800 C-47 transport planes, filled with more than 13,000 American paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, took to the air. Their mission, titled Operation Albany and Operation Boston, was the opening act of D-Day. They were the spearhead, jumping into the pitch-black void of occupied France to secure the roads and bridges behind the Normandy beaches. For these men, the Great Crusade began not with a landing craft, but with a leap into the unknown. As the planes crossed the French coastline, the peaceful flight turned into a hellscape. Thick, heavy clouds and a wall of German anti-aircraft fire, known as flak, shattered the formations. The night sky was suddenly illuminated by green and red tracers, arcing through the clouds like lethal fireworks. Terrified pilots, many flying their first combat mission, began to weave and dive to avoid the fire, increasing their speed far beyond the safe limit for jumping. Inside the vibrating fuselages, the paratroopers were tossed around like rag dolls, weighed down with nearly 100 pounds of gear, weapons, and reserve chutes. When the green light flashed, signaling the jump, the men didn't just step out, they were sucked into a chaotic vortex. Because the planes were flying too fast and were wildly off course, the paratroopers were scattered across hundreds of miles of the French countryside. Some fell into the flooded marshes of the Meurthe River, where the weight of their gear pulled them underwater, leading to silent, tragic drownings in the dark. Others landed directly in the middle of German-occupied villages. One famous paratrooper, John Steele, found his silk parachute snagged on the steeple of the church in Sainte-Mère-Église, where he hung helplessly, pretending to be dead, while a fierce battle raged below him. The midnight drop was a disaster on paper, but a stroke of genius in reality. Because the Americans were scattered everywhere, the German commanders were utterly confused. They received reports of paratroopers landing in dozens of different locations at once, leading them to believe the Allied force was 10 times larger than it actually was. This confusion paralyzed the German response during the most critical hours of the invasion. On the ground, the scattered paratroopers wandered through the hedgerows of Normandy, using small metal crickets to identify each other in the dark, one click answered by 2. Small groups of men who had never met before formed ad hoc units, led by whoever had the most stripes on their sleeve. They moved through the shadows, cutting telephone lines, blowing up bridges, and ambushing German patrols. By dawn, despite the chaos and the heavy losses, the paratroopers had achieved the impossible. They had captured the key town of Sainte-Mère-Église, the first town in France to be liberated, and secured the vital exits behind Omaha Beach. As the sun began to rise over the Atlantic, the exhausted men looked toward the sea and heard the thunderous roar of the Allied naval bombardment. The paratroopers had held the door open. Now the rest of the world was coming through. They had survived the darkness, and in doing so, they had ensured that the light of liberation would finally return to Europe.
At 5:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the horizon off the coast of France ignited. The silence of the English Channel was shattered by the collective roar of 6 battleships, 20 cruisers, and 68 destroyers. This was the Wall of Fire, a naval bombardment so intense that soldiers on the transport ships felt the vibrations in their very marrow. It was the largest armada ever assembled, aimed directly at Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Thousands of young men, soaked by sea spray and shivering from a mix of cold and adrenaline, looked toward the shore. They were heading for 5 code-named beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The plan was a masterpiece of synchronization, but as the first waves of landing craft dropped their ramps, the reality of war proved chaotic. In the westernmost sector at Omaha Beach, the current swept the U.S. 4th Infantry Division nearly 2,000 yards off course. It was a mistake that saved lives. They landed in a less defended zone. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., armed only with a cane and a pistol, realized the error and famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." His leadership turned a navigational blunder into a swift victory as the men moved inland with relatively light casualties. Further east, the British and Canadian forces faced their own trials. At Gold Beach, the British 50th Division struggled against high tides and hidden mines. Their goal was to capture Bayeux and link up with the Americans. Despite fierce resistance in the village of La Hamel, British grit and specialized Hobbit's funnies, tanks designed to clear mines and lay bridges, pushed the defenders back. Meanwhile, at Juno Beach, the Canadians faced some of the heaviest fire outside of Omaha. Their landing craft were battered by offshore reefs and German anti-tank guns. Many men were forced to jump into neck-deep water, charging through a hail of lead to clear the seawalls. By noon, however, the Canadians had made the deepest inland penetration of any Allied unit that day. At Sword Beach, the British 3rd Division landed with the specific objective of taking the city of Caen. They were met by the only major German armored counterattack of the day, the 21st Panzer Division. The fighting was desperate, but the British held their ground, supported by the legendary French commandos, who fought with a special ferocity to reclaim their occupied soil. But while progress was being measured in miles at the other beaches, time stood still at Omaha. This was the wall of fire at its most literal and deadly. The pre-invasion bombardment had missed the German bunkers, hidden behind thick clouds. As the ramps of the Higgins boats dropped, the men of the 1st and 29th Divisions were met with a concentrated storm of MG-42 machine gun fire. The beach was a labyrinth of steel hedgehogs and mines. Tanks that were supposed to swim ashore sank in the heavy swells. Within minutes, the shoreline was a graveyard of twisted metal and fallen men. For hours, the invasion at Omaha teetered on the brink of disaster. Men were pinned down behind a small shingle bank, unable to move. It was here that the wall of fire shifted from the ships to the hearts of the soldiers. Small groups of men, led by officers like Colonel George Taylor, realized that staying on the beach meant certain death. Taylor famously shouted, "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Through individual acts of suicidal bravery, soldiers began to blow gaps in the wire and scale the bluffs. Destroyers, seeing the crisis, risked grounding themselves by sailing dangerously close to the shore to blast German pillboxes at point-blank range. By midday, the wall of fire had finally breached the Atlantic Wall. The 5 beaches were no longer separate battlefields. They were the beginning of a single, unified front. The cost was staggering, but the foothold was secure. The Atlantic Wall, which Hitler boasted would last 1,000 years, had been shattered in a single morning by the sheer will of men who refused to stop moving forward.
If there was a place on earth where time stopped and hell opened its gates, it was a 5-mile crescent of sand in Normandy, codenamed Omaha. On the morning of June 6, 1944, this beach became the meat grinder. For the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, the invasion wasn't a strategic map or a grand maneuver. It was a terrifying, second-by-second struggle to stay alive in a landscape that wanted them dead. The disaster at Omaha began before a single soldier touched the sand. The massive naval and aerial bombardment meant to neutralize German defenses had failed, overshooting the bluffs due to heavy cloud cover. The German 352nd Infantry Division, battle-hardened and well-entrenched in concrete bunkers called Widerstandsnests, sat untouched. They waited in silence as the Higgins boats approached. When the ramps finally dropped,
The silence was replaced by the Hitler's baw saw, the terrifying 1,200 rounds per minute tear of MG-42 machine guns. For the first waves of American soldiers, the water was a death trap. Weighted down with 80 pounds of gear, many jumped into deep channels and drowned instantly. Those who made it to the shallows found no cover. The German gunners had the entire beach pre-ranged. Bullets whipped through the air so thickly they turned the water red. Mortar shells tossed sand and human remains into the air. Within 20 minutes of landing, most of the lead companies were leaderless, their officers and sergeants among the first to fall. Omaha was supposed to be supported by DD swimming tanks, but out of 32 tanks launched in the sector, 27 sank immediately in the rough 6-foot swells, taking their crews to the bottom of the channel. The infantry was alone. Survivors crawled toward the shingle, a small bank of smooth stones that offered the only sliver of protection from the grazing fire. Men huddled there, paralyzed by shock, watching the tide rise and push them closer to the German guns. The turning point of Omaha Beach didn't come from a grand command from a general on a ship. It came from the dirt. It came from men like Brigadier General Norman Cota, who walked upright along the beach, heedless of the snipers, waving his .45 caliber pistol and shouting, "Don't die on the beaches, die up on the bluffs if you have to, but get off the beaches." It came from the combat engineers, who, while losing half their strength, crawled forward to blow gaps in the hedgehog obstacles and barbed wire. The meat grinder was finally broken by small, disorganized groups of soldiers who decided they had had enough of hiding. They began to realize that the only way to survive was to move toward the fire. Using Bangalore torpedoes to blast through the wire, rangers and infantrymen began to claw their way up the steep, slippery draws. They climbed the bluffs with their fingernails and bayonets, flanking the German pillboxes that had been slaughtering their friends all morning. Simultaneously, U.S. Navy destroyers like the USS McCook and USS Carmack performed a feat of incredible daring. Seeing the infantry pinned down, they drifted so close to the shore that their keels nearly scraped the bottom, firing their 5-inch guns at point-blank range into the German stone fortifications. The sheer heat of the naval fire and the relentless pressure of the infantry finally cracked the Atlantic wall. By midday, the meat grinder had slowed. The bluffs were taken, and the first American soldiers were looking down at the beach they had just survived. It was a wasteland of burning tanks, shattered boats, and thousands of discarded gas masks and lifebelts. Over 2,400 Americans lay dead or wounded on those sands. Omaha was a victory, but it was a victory written in the blood of men who refused to be ground down. They had looked into the mouth of hell, and they had walked right through it.
By the late afternoon of June 6, 1944, the chaotic roar of the Atlantic Wall had begun to fade into a series of jagged, disconnected skirmishes. The wall was no longer a solid line of German steel. It had been punctured. This was the beginning of breaking the wall, the critical moment when the Allied forces stopped being an invading fleet and started becoming a continental army. The beachheads at Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword were no longer just narrow strips of sand. They were the lungs of the liberation, and they were finally starting to breathe. For the soldiers who had survived the morning, the transition from the beach to the inland bluffs was like entering a different world. They moved from the wide-open terror of the shore into the claustrophobic nightmare of the Normandy bocage, a landscape of ancient fixed stone walls and towering hedgerows that had been growing for centuries. Every hedge was a natural fortress, and every field was a potential killing zone. But the momentum had shifted. The Allies weren't just holding on, they were pushing. In the small town of Colleville-sur-Mer, just above Omaha Beach, weary American GIs moved house to house, clearing out the last of the German snipers. For the first time, they saw the faces of the people they were liberating. French civilians, who had spent 4 years under the shadow of the swastika, emerged from their cellars with tears in their eyes, offering bottles of cider and crusts of bread. It was a brief, emotional reminder of why they had crossed the channel. While the infantry moved inland, a logistical miracle was unfolding back on the water. The Allies knew that without a deep-water port like Cherbourg, the invasion would eventually starve. To solve this, they brought their own ports with them. Known as mulberry harbors, these were massive, prefabricated concrete blocks and floating roadways that were towed across the channel and sunk into place. Within hours of the first landings, these artificial harbors were already being assembled, allowing thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and vehicles to pour onto the continent. It was industrial warfare at its most magnificent. The German response, meanwhile, was paralyzed by the very thing the Allies had counted on: confusion. Because of the ghost army deception and the severed communication lines cut by the paratroopers, Hitler remained convinced that Normandy was a distraction. He spent the afternoon of June 6th sleeping, and his staff was too terrified to wake him to request the release of the elite panzer divisions held in reserve. By the time the German tanks were finally ordered to move, the Allied wall of fire from the sea and the air made it nearly impossible for them to reach the coast in daylight. As the sun began to set on the longest day, the 5 separate beachheads began to link up. The 156,000 men who had landed that day looked back at the sea and saw a horizon choked with ships as far as the eye could see. They had achieved the impossible. They had cracked the most formidable coastal defense in history. They had secured a foothold in Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. But the price of breaking the wall was carved into the landscape. The beaches were littered with the wreckage of a civilization at war. The cost of those first 24 hours was over 10,000 Allied casualties. Yet, as the stars came out over Normandy, the men knew the tide of history had turned. The Atlantic Wall was a ruin, and the road to Paris and eventually Berlin was open. The foothold was secure, and the light of freedom had finally returned to stay. The crusade for Europe had begun, and there was no turning back.